Do you know that feeling? The one where you walk through a place that was once your entire world and suddenly realize you've become a ghost in it. The coffee from the machine you helped choose tastes like a stranger's brew. The hum from the server room, a sound that was once the heartbeat of progress, now sounds more like a countdown. For 15 years, this company wasn't just my work. My name was etched onto the founding license of its $1.2 billion operation, the very bedrock. But to the new management, my name was just a historical footnote to be erased. They were about to learn that some footnotes hold the entire story together. So if you're listening to this right now, maybe in your car, maybe on a lunch break, just tell me one thing. Where are you listening from? Drop your city or country in the comments. I want to know how far this story travels. And if a part of you recognizes that feeling of being erased, stay with me. My name is Eliza Connolly, and for 15 years, my world was contained within the walls of a company I helped build from a single, audacious idea. I was its chief architect, the one who translated a dream of sustainable energy into the core technology that powered our growth. I remember the early days vividly, late nights fueled by cheap pizza, and the shared, unshakable belief that we were creating something that mattered. That shared belief was the engine that grew our little startup into a major player, the foundation of what would become a $1.2 billion operation. That foundation began to crack after the acquisition. A larger corporation bought us, and with them came a new language, a new philosophy. The soul of our work, once centered on innovation and long-term impact, was slowly replaced by the cold calculus of a spreadsheet. The new chief executive officer, a man named Peterson, whom I'd only ever seen in polished, pre-recorded corporate videos, spoke a language of key performance indicators, of optimizing operational efficiency, of shareholder value above all else. Our mission wasn't about the planet anymore, it was about monetizing intellectual property. My own role, once the very heart of the company's future, began to feel ceremonial, like a relic from a forgotten era. I saw my name on invitations to strategic planning meetings marked as optional. I would spend weeks crafting detailed reports on long-term research projects, the kind that once sparked week-long debates and breakthroughs, only to receive an automated, impersonal email reply, "Thank you for your submission." My budget for new exploratory science, the very lifeblood of our innovation, was frozen indefinitely, suffocated by a management team that saw research not as an investment, but as an expense. I was being erased, not with a single, merciful stroke, but with the slow, creeping indifference of 1,000 small cuts. It was a methodical, quiet removal, designed to make me feel so irrelevant that I would simply fade away on my own. The man orchestrating this slow fade was Mark, the new head of human resources, a sharp, ambitious man in an impeccably tailored suit. I remembered him differently. I remembered a nervous young analyst a decade ago, clutching a resume with more ambition than experience. I had seen a spark in him and had personally advocated for his hiring, believing he understood the values we were built on. Now, he saw people not as assets to be nurtured, but as liabilities on a balance sheet, and he was dismantling the very culture he had once vowed to protect. One Tuesday morning, I was walking back from the coffee station, the lukewarm liquid in my cup, a perfect metaphor for what the company had become. As I navigated the familiar maze of cubicles, I passed the main conference room. Its floor-to-ceiling glass walls, once a symbol of our commitment to transparency, now felt like a display case. Inside, Peterson stood with Mark, looking at a large screen that displayed a new organizational chart. My eyes, guided by a grim instinct, immediately found the section highlighted in a stark, unforgiving red. It was my entire department, my team of brilliant scientists, my life's work. I stopped for a moment, my body half hidden by a large ornamental plant that the new management had installed for employee wellness. The irony was not lost on me. I watched as Mark spoke to Peterson, his expression confident, his posture dismissive. He gestured towards that red box on the screen, the box that contained 15 years of my dedication. The glass was thick, meant to keep sound in, but I was close enough to see his lips form the words with chilling clarity. "Her entire division is a cost center," he said, the words forming without a hint of hesitation. "Her name on the old documents is a historical footnote. It has no bearing on our future." A quiet coldness spread through my chest, displacing any shock or sadness. It was the sharp, unwelcome clarity of a final truth revealed. They didn't just see me as obsolete. They saw the very foundation I had built as a burden. The countdown I had been feeling for months suddenly had a purpose. It wasn't a countdown to my departure, it was a countdown to their reckoning. The formal summons arrived in my inbox after lunch. The subject line was a masterpiece of corporate euphemism, a meeting to discuss new organizational alignments. It was an invitation to my own execution. Mark's office was a sterile glass box on the top floor. The panoramic view of the city skyline felt distant, a world I was no longer part of. Everything inside was meticulously arranged, from the identical pens on his desk to the abstract painting on the wall, chosen, I was sure, to project power. There were no personal touches, nothing to suggest the room belonged to a person rather than a corporate function. He greeted me with a smile that was all teeth and no warmth, a practiced expression I had seen him use with underperforming managers. He gestured for me to sit in a chair that, I noted, was intentionally and almost comically lower than his own. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. He slid a glossy printout of the new organizational chart across the polished surface of his desk. It was the same one from the conference room, a web of neat lines and boxes that had meticulously and ruthlessly erased my entire team. "Eliza," he began, his voice a smooth, rehearsed melody of corporate speak. "As you know, the company is moving towards a more streamlined, synergistic operational model. We're optimizing our resources for maximum shareholder return." He paused, letting the empty words hang in the air. "As part of this evolution," he continued, "we've made the difficult decision to dissolve the primary research and development department." He leaned back in his chair then, the picture of magnanimous leadership. "However," he said, a benevolent look on his face, "the chief executive officer and I recognize your long and storied history with the company. That's why we've created a special consultant role for you. It will allow you to continue providing your valuable expertise on a project-by-project basis." The offer was a profound and carefully constructed insult, disguised as a favor. A title with no team, a position with no power, a leash, not a lifeline. And I had no doubt, a salary that would reflect their new, diminished valuation of my worth. I let the silence stretch, filling the sterile office. I watched the confidence in his eyes, the slight tilt of his head as he waited. He expected gratitude for this small mercy. He expected negotiation, perhaps even tears. He was prepared for an emotional response he could then manage. I gave him none of it. I simply met his gaze, the gaze of the young man whose career I had helped launch, and I let him see nothing but calm, quiet finality. "No, thank you, Mark," I said, my voice perfectly level. "That won't be necessary." For the first time since I had entered the room, his professional mask slipped. It was just for a second, a brief flicker of genuine disbelief, a tightening in his jaw, quickly followed by a flash of annoyance. He had offered the departing queen a ceremonial role as a servant in the new court, and she had refused the gesture. The carefully constructed scene had gone off script. He recovered quickly, his corporate smile returning, but this time it had a sharp, dismissive edge. "As you wish," he said, his tone making it clear the offer was now rescinded. "Your access credentials will be deactivated by 5 o'clock. Security will escort you from the premises." He expected me to argue. He expected me to plead, to demand a severance package. He expected a scene. Instead, I just nodded. I stood up, smoothed the front of my jacket, and walked towards the door. The walk out of the building was surreal. Each step on the polished marble floor echoed with a finality that was deafening. Colleagues I had known for years averted their gaze, suddenly fascinated by their computer screens or the scuffs on their shoes. The security guard at the main entrance, a kind man named Frank who had always greeted me with a warm smile, couldn't meet my eyes as he walked me to the door. He held it open, and as I stepped into the late afternoon air, the life I had known for 15 years was officially over. But Mark, in his strategic brilliance, had overlooked one critical detail. He and his new chief executive officer had only deactivated my digital access. They had cut the power to my office, but they had forgotten that my most important credential, the one that truly granted access to the company's value, was never stored on their servers. It was stored in a fireproof safe in my home office. It wasn't a password. It was a promise, etched in ink on a piece of paper bearing my signature. The drive home was quiet, a profound silence that felt less like an ending and more like the calm before a storm. There was no anger, no surge of sadness. What I felt was a strange and potent clarity, the kind that comes when all illusions have been stripped away, leaving only the hard, unchangeable truth of the matter. My home office was the complete opposite of Mark's sterile chamber. It was a room filled with history, a testament to a journey they were now determined to forget. Bookshelves overflowed with scientific journals, old prototypes sat on display like cherished sculptures, and faded photographs of my original team were tacked to a corkboard. I didn't linger on the memories. My movements were slow, methodical. I knelt before the fireproof, safe tucked away in the closet, the cold metal a familiar touch. The soft clicks of the combination lock echoed in the quiet room. Inside, beneath files and old hard drives, was a heavy leather-bound portfolio. The gold lettering on the front was simple: incorporation and founding agreements. My fingers traced the words before I opened it. The paper inside was thick, bearing the original signatures of myself and the other co-founders, including my late husband. My eyes scanned past the standard articles of incorporation, landing on a section near the back, a section I had insisted on years ago. Section 4. B. The Cornerstone Clause. I hadn't read it in over a decade, but I remembered its spirit perfectly. It was our fail-safe, a protection for the creators against the business people who might one day forget how the business was created. It was not a simple tool of revenge, it was a precise mathematical instrument of consequence. It stipulated, in clear, unambiguous language, that should any founding signatory be terminated without due cause, and by non-mutual consent, they had the right to demand the company purchase their entire stake in the foundational intellectual property. The price was not to be negotiated. It was to be calculated by a pre-agreed formula. 20 times the net profit of the preceding fiscal year. It was a number designed to be fair when we were small, but now, with a $1.2 billion operation, it was a sum so catastrophic, it would shatter their balance sheet and force them into insolvency. A slow breath escaped my lips. This wasn't a loophole. It was a doorway I had built into the very foundation of the company, a key I had kept for an emergency I never thought would come. They had not just terminated me, they had done so with dismissive arrogance, erasing my department and offering an insulting, powerless role. It was the very definition of being terminated without due cause. They had breached the one clause that held everything together. I closed the portfolio slowly, the soft thud echoing in the quiet room. I picked up my phone, my hand perfectly steady, and found the number for my lawyer. He was an old friend, someone who had been there from the beginning. He picked up on the second ring. "Eliza, I just heard," he said, his voice full of concern. "I'm so sorry." "Don't be, David," I replied, my own voice perfectly level. "I have a question. Do you remember the cornerstone clause we put into the original licensing agreement?" There was a long pause on the other end of the line. I could almost hear him mentally retrieving the dusty file from the archives of his memory. Then, a slow, soft whistle. "My God, Eliza," he said, his voice now a mixture of disbelief and professional awe. "They didn't. Please tell me they didn't." "I believe," I said, looking out the window at the setting sun, "they've just made a $1.2 billion oversight." David's advice was simple and clear. There would be no emotional back and forth, no angry phone calls, no informal emails that could be dismissed or ignored. The next step had to be a formal, legally binding notification. It had to be a document as cold and hard as the contract itself. We spent the next day drafting the letter, a masterpiece of cold precision. We stripped it of all emotion, leaving only the hard facts of the contract and their breach of it. We cited Section 4B, the cornerstone clause, and stated my legal position. The letter informed the board of directors that I was exercising my right, giving them a 30-day remediation period to fulfill their contractual obligation to purchase my intellectual property stake at the price dictated by the formula. After that, the foundation of their entire operation would be subject to legal seizure. The next morning, I drove to the main post office. In an age of fleeting digital messages, I was creating a physical paper trail, one that could be proven in any court of law. I didn't just drop the letters in a mailbox. I stood in line and paid for certified mail with a return receipt requested for each of the 10 identical envelopes. One for the chief executive officer, and one for each of the 9 board members sent to their private residences. There would be no plausible deniability. The postal worker stamped the envelopes with a heavy, satisfying thud. It felt less like sending a letter and more like setting the timer on a bomb. The days that followed were filled with a profound and strategic silence. I had expected frantic calls from their legal department, perhaps a threatening letter from their own high-priced lawyers. But there was nothing. The lack of response was a power play, a strategic decision to treat my notification as insignificant, the ramblings of a disgruntled former employee. They believed by ignoring me, they could make me irrelevant. They didn't understand the contract, didn't require their participation, only their notification. The 30-day clock was ticking whether they chose to watch it or not. I didn't check my phone obsessively. I didn't pace my house with anxiety. I started working in my garden, pulling weeds and tending to new life, finding a certain irony in the fact that while I was cultivating something real and living, the roots of the company I had built were beginning to rot from a poison of their own making. The silence was finally broken a week later. The call was from Arthur, one of the original board members, a good man who I knew felt trapped in the new corporate culture. His voice was strained, laced with a panic he was trying and failing to conceal. "Eliza, what in God's name have you done?" he asked, skipping any greeting. "There's a letter, they're passing it around." "I simply informed the board of a pre-existing contractual obligation, Arthur. That's all," I replied calmly. He let out a short, frustrated laugh. "Informed them? Eliza, they aren't taking it seriously." Peterson, the chief executive officer, laughed about it in a senior staff meeting. He called it a bluff. He paused, and his voice dropped lower, closer to a whisper. "And Mark, from Human Resources, he made a show of it. In front of 3 other executives, he held up your certified letter and handed it to his assistant. He told her to file it under archived history." I thanked him for the information and hung up the phone, a cold stillness settling over me. The arrogance was breathtaking. The theatrical, dismissive gesture was their attempt to project power, to show everyone that my claim was meaningless trash. But in their attempt to display strength, they had just made a fatal error. They had just provided me with something priceless, a sworn witness to their own willful negligence. When I told David about the incident with the archived letter, his response was immediate and sharp. I could hear the change in his tone, the calm concern replaced by the focused intensity of a lawyer who has just been handed a critical piece of evidence on a silver platter. "Willful negligence," he said, the words cutting through the phone line. "He confirmed it, Eliza. They've moved beyond simple arrogance into active recklessness." David explained that by knowingly disregarding a formal legal notice in front of witnesses, the company could no longer claim ignorance or simple error in any future proceeding. They had been made aware of a critical financial risk and had consciously, theatrically, disregarded it. He chuckled softly, a dry, humorless sound. "You know, I remember when you and your husband insisted on that wording. I thought it was overkill then. I have never been so happy to be wrong." His advice, however, remained unchanged. "Do nothing," he said firmly. "Wait. The 30-day clock is still ticking. Let them continue to believe they are in control." And so, I waited. 2 more weeks passed in that strange, suspended silence. From the outside, nothing had changed. The company's stock price was stable. Their press releases were filled with optimistic projections about new markets. To any casual observer, it would seem their strategy of ignoring me had worked. The ghost had been successfully exorcised. I continued to tend to my garden, finding a certain quiet irony in the daily ritual. I spent the afternoons pruning back old growth on the rose bushes, a slow, patient process of removing what was dead to make way for what was to come. I was cultivating order and growth from the soil, while the roots of the company I had built were beginning to rot from a poison entirely of their own making. They just couldn't see it yet. The first tremor came not from an internal memo or a panicked email, but from across the Atlantic. My phone rang late one afternoon. It was Arthur, the cautious board member. The strain in his voice from our last call had now escalated into raw, unshielded panic. "It's the German deal, Eliza," he said, his words tumbling out, skipping any greeting. "The Munich distribution contract, it's on hold indefinitely." He explained the situation breathlessly. Their meticulous German partners were in the final stages of renewing an $80 million contract. As part of their routine due diligence, a process they treated with near religious sanctity, they had requested a currently executed copy of the company's license for the core technology. It was a standard request, a box to be checked. Of course, the only foundational document my former company could provide was the original agreement, the one bearing my signature. The German legal team, precise as always, noted my recent departure as a key figure and asked for a simple updated addendum, a new document proving the chain of ownership for the intellectual property was secure and undisputed. My former company had nothing to show them. Faced with an unclear and broken chain of ownership, the Germans had immediately put the entire $80 million deal on indefinite hold. For a company like theirs, a contract is a sacred text. Any ambiguity, any question about the legitimacy of a foundational license was not a problem to be solved later. It was a foundational flaw that halted everything instantly. Arthur told me the chief executive officer, Peterson, was furious, railing at his own legal department for the oversight during a senior staff meeting. Mark, the head of human resources, was reportedly trying to dismiss it all as a minor bureaucratic hiccup, assuring everyone with false confidence that it would be sorted out in a matter of days. They were beginning to understand this wasn't an issue that could be solved with a termination form. They were starting to see the ghost they thought they had banished. While that fire was starting to burn in their boardroom, I received a quiet, automated email. It wasn't from a panicked executive or a concerned colleague. The sender was the United States Patent and Trademark Office. I opened it calmly, my heart rate steady. It was a formal notification, a piece of cold digital bureaucracy. An application, filed by my former company just 3 days prior, had been reviewed. It was an application to amend the primary patent license for the company's core technology, and it had been rejected. The reason for the rejection was listed in simple, emotionless text that carried more weight than any angry letter ever could. Failure to secure the signature of all original listed licensors. I felt no joy, no thrill of victory. It was the quiet, grim satisfaction of an engineer watching a complex machine perform its function flawlessly. The gears I had set in motion 15 years ago were turning, one by one, with unstoppable precision. They had tried to erase me from an organizational chart in an office meeting. Now, they had tried to erase my name from a federal record, from the permanent legal history of the technology itself. They were learning that some signatures don't fade, they are etched in law. This was more than another mistake. It was a desperate act, and now it was a documented one. It proved they knew my signature was legally required and had actively tried to circumvent the process. I forwarded the official rejection notice from the patent office to David with a single line, "For your records." His reply came minutes later, stripped of all pleasantries, sharp and focused. "They are officially building our case for us, Eliza," he wrote. "Every move they make demonstrates a clear pattern of incompetence and bad faith. The arrogance is turning to desperation. And desperate people make bigger mistakes." He was right. My strategy of quiet, patient pressure was working more effectively than I could have imagined. The company, through its own panicked, reckless actions, was tightening the noose around its own neck. It was only a matter of time before their internal problem became a very public one. The news about the stalled German deal finally leaked, starting as a small article in a respected financial journal. It was carefully worded, never mentioning my name, but spoke of intellectual property uncertainties and a foundational licensing dispute. The implication was a clear fissure in the company's foundation. The market, which abhors ambiguity, reacted instantly. The company's stock took its first noticeable dive, and this external pressure forced the chief executive officer, Peterson, to call an emergency all-hands meeting. A recording of it was forwarded to me by a former colleague. I listened to Peterson's tight, forced confidence as he blamed the disruption on outdated legacy contracts and a disgruntled former employee. Then Mark, the head of human resources, took the microphone, his voice booming with false authority. "I want to be perfectly clear. he said. Our world-class legal team has reviewed this frivolous claim and has determined it has absolutely no merit. We have the situation completely under control. It was a desperate performance. Just as I finished listening, my phone rang. It was David, his tone no longer calm, but sharp and serious. "Eliza, they filed a lawsuit against you," he said, a grim edge to his voice. "They are suing you for corporate extortion and attempted business interference." Extortion. It was a bold, aggressive, and incredibly foolish move. My first reaction was not fear, but a cold, calculating calm. I could see the monumental blunder they had just made. "They just gave us the keys, didn't they?" I said quietly. "The keys to the entire kingdom," David confirmed, his voice sharp with focus. "This lawsuit is their attempt to intimidate you, but what they've actually done is legally compel themselves to participate in the discovery process. They have to turn over everything: emails, board meeting minutes, internal memos. They think they've cornered you, but they've actually invited us into their house to search for evidence." The company made the lawsuit public, issuing a press release that painted me as a greedy villain, engaging in extortionist tactics. It was a hardball move designed to isolate me, but it had the precise opposite effect. For others who had been pushed out or silenced by the new management, it was a declaration of war, and it inadvertently called them to my side. My phone began to ring. The first calls were from former engineers, brilliant minds from my core team who were laid off in Mark's restructuring. "Eliza, we saw the news," one said, his voice tight with anger. "It's a lie. We were in the project meetings last year when the acquisition lawyers flagged the founder's license as a major potential risk. We have the email threads. Peterson was on them, he knew. Within hours, my lawyer had a secure, anonymous channel set up, and the evidence started to trickle in proof that their negligence wasn't an oversight, but a calculated risk. Then, a more significant call came from Robert, the original chief executive officer who had started the company with me. He was horrified. "I read their press release, Eliza," he said, his voice heavy with disappointment. "They're trying to rewrite our history. That clause was put in there to protect the creators. I am more than willing to provide a sworn affidavit to that effect. I'll testify in court if it comes to that." His support was a powerful validation of my entire claim. The final call of the day came from a number I didn't recognize. The man introduced himself as a senior journalist from a major financial newspaper. He said he had been following the story: the stalled deal, the stock dip, and now the bizarrely aggressive lawsuit. The company's official narrative, he said, just didn't make sense. He wanted to hear the other side of the story. Off the record. I paused, looking out my window. The battle had, until now, been fought through lawyers and legal notices. This was an invitation to fight in a new arena: the court of public opinion. It was time for the market to understand the difference between a name on a payroll and a name on a patent. My meeting with the journalist led to a devastating, meticulously researched article. It laid out the timeline of events in stark detail, recasting the narrative from a disgruntled employee to one of reckless management. The stock, already wounded, plunged into a freefall. The quiet tremor had become a full-blown catastrophe. The summons came from the chairman of the board himself, an emergency meeting. The power dynamic had shifted completely. They were no longer suing me into silence. They were pleading for me to speak. We met in the main boardroom. I sat with David on one side. Across from us sat a pale Peterson and a fidgeting Mark, surrounded by the grim-faced board. The chairman began, his voice low. "Miss Connolly, we are here to listen." I gave a small nod to David. He stood and, without accusation, simply constructed a fortress of facts. He methodically presented the entire chain of evidence: the termination, the ignored legal notice, the witness to their negligence, the stalled German contract, the patent rejection, and finally, the emails proving Peterson had knowingly concealed the risk from the board. When he finished, a heavy silence fell. The most powerful investor on the board, a formidable woman known for her shrewd decisions, fixed her gaze on Peterson. "Mr. Peterson," she said, her voice quiet but sharp. "A simple yes or no. Did you have prior knowledge of this financial risk when you authorized her termination?" Peterson's silence was his confession. The investor's gaze turned from inquiry to icy contempt. the meeting fractured. As we walked out, leaving them to their own implosion, I knew their time was up. The next morning, the 30th day had passed. At precisely 8:30, I made a single phone call to David. Proceed. At 9 a.m., our press statement was released. It announced the formal filing of my legal claim for the mandatory purchase of my intellectual property, a sum that would render the company insolvent. All production lines halted, the stock was suspended. Before noon, the chief executive officer and the head of human resources were terminated. The house they had managed so poorly had collapsed. A week later, the board approached me with a desperate offer, an obscene amount of money to withdraw the claim, a seat on the board, anything I wanted. I refused. It was never about reclaiming my old house. I took the settlement that the contract afforded me. And with that capital, I started something new. I launched a new company, built on the original mission of ethical research and genuine innovation. I hired back the brilliant minds that had been cast aside, the believers who had been silenced. They didn't just forget my name, they thought my name had lost its power. They learned that a signature on a founding document is more than ink on paper. It is the cornerstone. And you cannot remove a cornerstone without bringing the entire house down. This story is a reminder that the loudest voice in the room is not always the most powerful. True strength is often found in the quiet, deliberate moves made, while others are focused on the noise. It's in the foundations you build and the value you know you hold, even when others choose to forget it. If you have ever felt undervalued, or have quietly planned your own strategic exit from a place that no longer deserved your talent, know that you are not alone. If this story spoke to you, please like, comment, and share it with someone who's still finding their own voice.